So what did everyone get in the Guardian's populism quiz? I definitely got that. I didn't really want to get him because he's a ponytail. I don't trust people with ponytails. Pablo Iglesias.
Yeah, I'm ashamed to say I got the same.
I got Iglesias too.
I didn't do it, but I obviously wouldn't have got Iglesias.
You say that now.
I didn't do it either. Actually, I probably would have got Iglesias because presumably that was putting all the non-ridiculous answers in.
Well, no, there was one question which I think if you answered the correct way on this, you would have got AMLO, who would have much rather got than Iglesias, which is like, it's obviously one of those questions where you have strongly agree and strongly disagree. And I think if it says, do you like left-wing people, and say strongly disagree, you might have got
Yeah, exactly.
Well, but I mean, look, any good Marxist should answer that they dislike leftists. I mean, let's be honest. Otherwise, what's the point?
That's absolutely true.
I think that's the first criterion nowadays to see whether anyone's actually a decent Marxist is whether you get along with the existing left, and if you do, then there's clearly a very, very big. There's a very, very big problem.
I'm sorry, some of my best friends are leftists, so.
It's Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast, at the end of history. What comes next? Well, for the foreseeable future, more populism. If the era of post-politics after the Cold War was characterized by consensus politics and technocracy, our times now, what we here call the end of history, are dominated by populist upsurges. Is this something to be welcomed? I mean, it could be a sort of herald of repoliticization, but it might also be, as the anti-populists have it, a bunch of emotional, Manichaean, rejectionistic or opportunistic and illiberal politics. So this is our last episode of 2018, and we're discussing these questions with Anton Jaeger, a doctoral student at Cambridge and one of the sharpest new scholars of populism out there. We'll also be referencing a recent book which has been very widely discussed already, called For Left Populism by Belgian political theorist Chantal Mouffe, which aims to give a theoretical framework to left populism, a political strategy that she sees embodied in a range of new leftist projects across Europe, many of which we've already discussed on this podcast over the course of this year. Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, Jean-Luc Mélenchon's La France Insoumise, Syriza, Podemos, Die Linke in Germany, and the Bloco de Esquerda in Portugal. So, is there any future to left populism, or is it another dead end? All this right now. Welcome everyone to Alpha Bunga Bunga. We've got the full complement of regular Alpha Bunga Bunga co-hosts and co-producers, and we are very happy to welcome Anton Jaeger, who you heard about in the introduction, with us to discuss populism, an episode which we've been meaning to do for a very long time. So this is the last Alpha Bunga Bunga of the year. We've done stuff about Asia, Africa, Europe, and North and South America. Done stuff about big ideas, small ideas, even some dumb ideas, maybe. So we'd first of all like to start off by thanking all our very smart guests who've hopefully made us smarter over the course of the year and maybe made our very smart listeners even smarter. And thank you for choosing Alpha Bunga Bunga as your podcast so that we might carry on this conversation about the crises of our time. And there's no such greater one than the question of populism. One author we're going to discuss today even defines our times as the populist moment. So we need to maybe start off by dealing with the big issue, which is one of the leading scholars of populism, somehow, Cas Mudde. What's the big deal with Cas Mudde? And we're going to go to Anton for this.
I think his influence on the Guardian series is I think he himself admits that it's a bit double. It is a kind of Sorcerer's Apprentice story where he, I think, really wanted to contribute to the series, but then he found out that the actual sort of child or the intellectual brainchild of what came about in the series didn't exactly look what he wanted it to look like, and now I think he's a bit recoiling Frankenstein-like from what's actually out there. So I'm not entirely sure whether the series is deeply Muddean or what we're witnessing is just Mudde seeing that his offspring is not as pleasing as he'd like to think it is in that way.
Well, I hadn't heard of him before, I guess, last year when his name started popping up everywhere. He was the person to cite on populism. But who exactly is he? He seemed like somebody who was relatively irrelevant until recently.
Well, I think he's one of the people who really was very early to what you could call the populism boom. So in the late 90s, I think he worked with Peter Mayer for some time, and then in the early 2000s, he was one of the first to write this article called The Populist Zeitgeist. And I think it really launched populism as a buzzword and got a whole sort of populism industry going. And I think he's been a very, very successful gatekeeper, or in a sense, he's maintained his status as a pioneer. So if you want to start out in the field of populism studies, there's no way you can't pay lip service to him in that sense.
So how do you get into the populism racket? I guess on one level, if you want to get into the politics, you just give Putin a phone call. On the other level, how do you get into the academic field?
Well, I guess everyone stumbles upon some kind of topic of interest at a certain point. But what I remember is reading this French author called Jean-Claude Michéa, who's a bit of a shady figure, who's now closely associated with the Gilets jaunes as well, who's kind of seen as what you could call a rat fascist, but who really wrote some fascinating books. And there's just one passage in one of the books where he takes a fragment from this magazine by Sartre and de Beauvoir in the 60s, where they use the word populism in quite a laudatory but at the same time descriptive way. And then he contrasts this to a different passage in a French newspaper in the early 90s. And the question he asks is just like, how come there's been this massive semantic drift from this moment in the early 60s when populism could be used in a more sort of neutral, less overheated way until the late 1980s, when it was a sort of alpha and omega of political crisis already in Europe. And he just threw up this question as a sort of incentive to do research about it. And then I said, well, I mean, someone should actually look into what happened in those 30 years when the word populism really found its way to the European vocabulary. And I think that's how the ball got rolling.
Well, I guess one way of looking at this is that, maybe populism isn't even the most useful word in the world. There's a lot of crap written about populism. It's become a crutch for a huge amount of people to describe things that they simply don't like. We're very conscious of the fact that populism might say more about the user than the object that they're willing to describe. And yet, I don't think there's a way of escaping the use of it. Maybe that's a question. Is there a way of escaping use of it? One thing that we're going to come on to discuss in a little bit more depth is Chantal Mouffe's For Left Populism. And she characterized contemporary politics as being defined by this populist moment. So do you think this is a useful term? Should we stick to it? And do you agree with Mouffe's characterization of this being a populist moment?
Well, I think there's a descriptive and a normative question here. And descriptively, I definitely think that the word populism, even in the Muddean sense, captures a really central dimension of the crisis of political representation that certainly European polities are undergoing at the moment. And so there's of course a danger that populism as an external referent for liberals who like to sort of evade the fact that there is a systemic crisis in European or Western or even global democracies more large, and like to stick to these kind of surface readings where, you have these sort of malicious individuals that convince voters with Russian bots to vote for all these badly mannered politicians. In that sense, the word populism has little descriptive value because it's just a way to deflect criticisms of a really decrepit liberalism. But at the same time, it's undeniable that the way certainly the party political landscape has been reordered in the last 20 years, where you have the sort of absolute decline of party membership, you have this growing void between elites and basically national populations, just makes it almost inevitable that the word populism just captures a really, really important aspect of what we're living through. And I think, I agree with Mouffe that we're definitely living through some populist moment, but I'm much more skeptical and not very optimistic about what kind of political opportunity such a populist moment really offers, because she sees it as a sort of opportunity to seize, and it's a way to reinvent a moribund left. While I think it's actually, just another sort of step in the vortex that's been dragging us down in the last 30 years, basically, certainly on the left.
The weird thing to me about the central claim of the book is that she's the one who made such a great effort to bury the left in the 1980s, to kind of get away from, to make the kind of build the theory for the Rainbow Coalition of gay rights, green eco struggles, feminism, all of this, to get away from traditional working class struggles. And now she turns around and says that she's, wants to kind of bring about a left populist moment, and as if she had no role herself to play in overcoming traditional kind of left politics through her theorizing in the 1980s, because the Rainbow Coalition stuff was entirely absorbed into corporate neoliberalism. That became progressive neoliberalism.
Yeah, and I really agree with that judgment. So there's, again, a sort of sorcerer's apprentice story, as with Mudde, where what you see, for example, with people who, analogously to Mouffe, start calling for a kind of left populism in the early 1980s, such as Laclau, but also someone like Stuart Hall, for example, who are, as you say, the first proponents of this British version of the Rainbow Coalition. In the early 90s, there's a very, very strange moment where they're actually very enthusiastic about this new figure in the Labour Party called Blair. And they say Blair really exemplifies our populist approach. And then there's a kind of volte-face in the middle of the 90s where they realize that Blair is actually not that big a break with Thatcherism as they wish he'd be. But at the same time, this moment of sympathy on behalf of Stuart Hall and even Ernesto Laclau at a certain moment for Blair has always really it's always really fascinated me, because, as you say, there was this attempt to bury the left in the 1980s. Then came along a figure that they thought could carry out their job and actually did bury the left, but then he didn't bury the left in the right way. And now they have to resurrect a sort of zombie left, which is, infrastructurally no longer there, because they've realized that they've actually maybe thrown out the baby with the bathwater almost.
I just want to ask, in terms of what do you mean by burying the left in the wrong way? I mean, which way was the correct way to bury the left for them?
Well, I think they wanted to with Stuart Hall, it was mainly the idea to get the Labour Party to move away from a sort of classical, almost corporatist workerism, where you have this complete monopoly in the working class vote on behalf of the Labour Party, but you can't really expand beyond that. So he wanted to make it a sort of broader coalition that can actually draw in a larger constituency. But
draw in the middle classes and move away from producer-based disputes, I guess, disputes about the productive process, economic disputes, and so on.
Yes, absolutely. And I don't think he saw. I don't think he envisioned the actual destruction of, for example, the trade union movement. But at the same time, when you read people like Laclau and Hall on the miners' strike, there's a very strong sense in that they think that this kind of politics is just outmoded and belongs to a previous historical epoch, and this kind of struggle is actually alienating for this wider electorate left-wing parties should be appealing to. But at the same time, so again, I think there is this moment of trauma where they realize that this advocacy has gone too far, while you might even say, well, maybe Blair has just done what they didn't really dare to do, and in the end they realized that Blair was there. They've just been the kind of useful apologist for Blair.
It's amazing, as Phil has already said, how easily recuperated these ideas were. The sort of Rainbow Coalition went forward as the kind of ideological substance to a sort of left neoliberalism. And it might be worth considering in these times when the sort of left populism of Mouffe is being proposed with slightly different characteristics now to what was done in 1985 when she wrote Hegemony and Social Strategy with Laclau, that perhaps her notion of the people and the citizen might also be too easily recuperated. And maybe then it's worth considering what might be a more sort of solid anchor for anti-systemic movements, which can't be so easily recuperated by capital.
Yeah, I think if you want to talk about as we said, first populist of the 1990s, that was again Blair. I mean, the whole idea of Blair was to stop talking about class and get the notion of the people involved. The way he spoke after the death of Diana, I think he called her the people's princess. So this was completely consistent with the approach that was being proposed in the 1980s by the likes of Hall and Laclau and Mouffe. But at the same time, I also think that the way something like Hegemony and Social Strategy was written, but also the later works, it's a bit like writing a sort of football guide or a guide on how to win a football game when you're already 12 points behind and you've sold off all of your best players and you've just got a really, really bad trainer in. So a lot of these, I think, tactics are premised and predicated on defeat and also are premised on a kind of abdication or an intellectual application on some really important questions such as the party, what is the relationship between a party and a larger sort of social movement. And at the same time, structurally, or I'd say conjuncturally, left populism has always operated in an era of decline. I think what Peter Mayer called the so-called era of ruling the void is actually the natural habitat of left populism. And I think this might sound very aggressive, but at the same time, I think left populism today is precisely attractive because this void is just a sort of structural fact that anyone who wants to engage in politics nowadays can no longer avoid. So what populism does is that it offers you a communication divide to actually bridge that void, and it offers you a kind of illusion of immediacy and of handy political consultancy. But it doesn't actually engage any real forms of political mediation that might ask the question, well, how do we get people to actually influence political affairs in a very concrete way? And in this sense, left populism has always been sort of fatally indebted to the era of post-democracy, basically. Because at the same time, it's kind of a contestant of a post-democratic consensus. This is always how populism is, or left populism is also presented, like it repoliticizes things which have been shut out from democratic decision-making. But at the same time, there's a really, really weird correlation between the rise of post-democracy and the calls and the praxis of left populism. So in a sense, I think they're actually sort of twin brothers who might engage in occasional fights, but who actually have a sort of very deep consanguinity on many fronts.
So, hi, Anton. So, Georgia, first, a couple of things. First, I think that's a very well-deserved sideswipe at Mourinho, and just had to get there, and as a Liverpool fan. But secondly, just to bring it back maybe a little bit to Mouffe's book, and I think one of the things which struck me is that it takes a lot from Stuart Hall's analysis of Thatcherism. So Mouffe's argument is clearly indebted to the way that Stuart Hall conceptualized Thatcherism as a very successful political project. What do you think is valuable in this, I guess, in this account that Mouffe presents? And is there anything that's missing? I mean, I guess the question is there anything that we can learn on the left from Thatcher, this much maligned figure, at least on the British left?
I'll be honest, I don't think there's that much really to salvage from Hall's analysis of Thatcherism, except for the fact that Thatcher was really ruthless as a politician, and if the left wants to learn a lesson in ruthlessness or political ruthlessness, or what you could call a sort of political maximalism, almost a la Lenin, I think Thatcher is a really good example. But at the same time, I think what Mouffe mainly takes from Hall, and what Hall is really famous for in his analysis of Thatcherism, is a very, very culture, sort of media-based explanation of what actually constitutes the success of the Thatcherite formula. So it's the idea, because Thatcher had these sort of strategic henchmen within certain newspapers, because there is this sort of cultural bias within a certain section of the British media elite, that's the reason that Thatcher actually managed to convince such a large portion of the British electorate to vote for her. And
it's quite interesting actually the way you point to it, because in terms of like Mouffe's analysis of what is like distinctive about populism, it's kind of basically like you need a good message and a charismatic leader, and that's really the strategy. It's kind of like she really buys this idea of like Thatcher as this singular force who just got the messaging right, and thus was a success.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Anton, just to jump in, add another question there. Is there a danger of almost kind of accepting this and moving too much towards as you said, a media and culture explanation? Because it seems like that's often a key ingredient of analysis, like crude analyses of populism, that it's essentially, it's all about social media, and it's basically like all we need to do to get a left government in power is just to be a little bit better at Twitter and a little bit more effective at I mean, so I guess adding on to Ben's question, my question is it almost kind of a bit of red herring, a bit of a danger for the left to say, well, okay, if the lesson learned is we need to just have all these civil society actors, does this just lead us into spending more time on Twitter and actually not really achieving very much?
Well, I think there's, like, again, the question of whether Hall's analysis of Thatcherism is correct. So the idea that the way she won was through soft power and not through the sort of hard coercive power of the state. And then the other question is, well, I mean, if that analysis is correct, is it a strategy that should be applied on the left as well? And I think, I mean, the soft power interpretation of Thatcherism, or the idea that soft power is really causally the most efficacious in helping her win, is actually not that likely. I mean, there had been international pressure from even the IMF on labor governments in the 1970s, and the way the miners' strike was broken was not through sort of cultural manipulation or the media. It was basically just by sending brute, almost firepower to the north and breaking strikes.
But I think also it's important, sorry to interject, Anton, this is Phil, but I think it's also important, though, not to get trapped in this dichotomy between soft power and hard power. At the end of the day, I mean, I think that this is the problem with the kind of Stuart Hall line, that it's all, the idea is predicated on politics as manipulation. Exactly. On politics as kind of dark arts of persuasion. I mean, you can even, I would even go as far as to say he's kind of setting up the theory of New Labour spin doctors in advance of the fact. The fact is that Thatcher managed to persuade sufficient numbers of voters to get through the British electoral system. And she did use the kind of hard power of the state, not least in Ireland, as well as against the miners. But at the end of the day, she also had a political message that there weren't enough, that she was able to convince enough working class voters in a way that the Labour Party weren't. And that stretched even past her defeat into the first major government. So, I mean, I think that's my concern with the Stuart Hall narrative, is that it already kind of sets up the New Labour narrative, and that it understands politics as this game of trying to insinuate yourself into people's consciousness without actually persuading them or winning them to some kind of vision.
Sorry, Anton.
I just want to come in here just as well, following Phil, because that's kind of like how Thea Riofrancos, who is another scholar of populism, in her review in N+1 of Mouffe's book, which is called Populism Without the People, if you want to check it out, basically says that like her call for leadership with an impeding platform is basically like politics as normal, but who is the base? It's kind of like, where do ordinary actors, working class people involved in actual struggles come in terms of this type of politics? It's really like they're kind of passive.
Well, I think like the media centrism, which is very prevalent already in Hall's analysis of Thatcherism, has led to, for example, the caricatural idea that the only thing the left needs to do is to stop the BBC from being so right wing and get some like.
That's hegemony.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Which is basically hegemony. And when you hear people such as Owen Jones or other people on the extremely online left constantly complain about right-wing bias in all these media quarters, and at the same time, I don't want to pretend that.
That's why we set up Alpha Banga Banga.
Well, but I think in the question, there's just a question of like what kind of institutions you really want to build. And I think because of the academization of a large part of the left, they inevitably turn towards the media as the only way to relate to a sort of popular constituency.
Just for the record, for our listeners, that was a joke. We did not set up Alpha Banga Banga to take on the mainstream media or to construct Stuart Hall-inspired leftist hegemony to set it up for Owen Jones. That is entirely not our plan.
Or is it a joke? Wait until the Patreon arrives and then make your own mind up, listeners.
But I thought this was your counter-hegemonic apparatus. I mean, this looks all very, very impressive.
Well, thank you for complimenting our apparatus, but...
Well, you see, basically, if you look at our strategy properly, we're trying to make a Silvio Berlusconi of the left.
That's it, yeah.
Well, exactly. And it's also, again, premised on this idea that, well, the only way you can build constituencies, the only way that you can mediate between a base and a cadre is through spin doctors, basically. So it is what you could call a sort of a permanent popular will speculation, where you hire these specialists to read this like set of desires or set of affects within the population, and then you need to translate them onto a level on the state, which is, again, as Phil says, an extremely top-down and in a way also elitist view of what popular will formation actually consists in, because it just means that you need to have these organic intellectuals who are kind of flying above this formless mass or this formless mob, and then needs to rally them into a coherent project, basically. But at the same time, it just speaks to the sort of sociological composition of large parts of the left, because they're stuck in the academia or because they're stuck in the media world, and they have this feeling of helplessness. They try and rationalize and they try and remedy that feeling of helplessness by actually saying, well, it's not a problem that we're in this, that we've been sidelined. It's not a problem that we're actually helpless, because we can still do serious politics if only we do enough handy left-wing PR, basically.
I think there's a certain kind of irony if we look at the trajectory from, Thatcherism's ideological appeal to contemporary proposals for left populism, which is that if we're taking Thatcherism's ideological appeal seriously, even if we're, understanding that it's restricted and doesn't entirely explain why she was able to transform British society, that there was a lot of hard power in there as well. But nevertheless, if we understand her ideological appeal as resting on a certain populist notion of appeal to the ordinary man, to the taxpayer, to the family, to the individual versus, classes or trade unions, if it rests on that, then, the opposition to that, as proposed by Stuart Hall, as George and Anton have already discussed, was the sort of rainbow coalition. What the contemporary proposals for left populism seem to do, on face value, is to go beyond that, to appeal to a people which isn't based necessarily and so explicitly on a fragmented, divided up people's consisting of various different identities. It seems to, in some way, be a return to at least this kind of, pre-Marxist, radical Republican notion of the people against oppression, right? I don't know if you agree with that kind of characterization, but at least on face value, that's what it sounds like to me.
I think that's a good point. Alex. But also, I think this is the earlier point is she's the one who tried to disassemble any sense of collective popular
but that's
actors.
the irony.
She's the one who tried to disperse it. But this is what's so frustrating about her book, is her refusal to take responsibility for her own role in bringing about the present. So it's her own political mistakes and her own theoretical conclusions that half-heartedly set up our contemporary problems.
If we're going to be explicit here, what does this people look like? The Gilets jaunes is about as close as you can get to that in terms of contemporary examples, right? It is a people which has constituted itself out of nothing, which sets up in opposition to a political elite, and which is rooted in sort of material demands, which, may or may not be dealt with by the current system, or may completely exceed the capacity of the current system to respond to those demands. And so there's no kind of rainbow coalition there necessarily. There's a whole variety of different actors which are constituted in different ways. You do have the anti-racist struggle, which is part of it, which is, as we discussed at length in our previous episode. But nevertheless, you don't have this sort of fragmented people. They're all gilets jaunes. So I think, but you're right, Phil, that she doesn't reckon with her own role in precisely in pursuing fragmentation as a strategy.
But you see, that's not how she sees it. I don't think you're going to get her own admittance that she was wrong. In fact, she'll probably say that she was right. Because if you look at the way that, at least the narrative that Laclau and Mouffe's theoretical work has constituted political advance, it's that firstly, it was key to certain moments and theorists within the pink tide, which then came back into Europe through Podemos and Syriza. And in that sense, populism has been constitutive of this new left, while the legacies of Syriza in particular are quite mixed. And the pink tide has kind of rescinded.
That's a mild way to put it about Syriza.
I'm being purposely understated, but the point is that she sees her own work, and that's why she's intervening like this, as being indicative of the success of recent left politics in return.
No, absolutely. And but I'm saying this is, there's a fundamental dishonesty there and a limit to how much she can offer us, precisely because she's unwilling to actually account for her own role in a way that's critical and able to actually take a full engagement with it. And it's striking, in fact, something that she says in the book is that Syriza was simply defeated. She says that they were simply kind of pummeled into submission by the European Union, which isn't actually, Syriza failed. They failed. They had choices and they made the wrong choices. and she's unwilling to countenance that. It's simply a show of force, as to why her favourite kind of Greek left populists were defeated.
Yeah, I also think that the real problem, certainly with the way the theory gets presented today, is that there is no recognition of what the conditions of possibility for left populism really are. So what has to happen to the party political landscape, what has to happen to the relationship, or just the political field in general, for that left populist strategy to actually work. And I think also when you look at the Syriza episode, so she says, oh, this obviously just failed. But at the same time, when just looking at what happened in 2015 coming up to the referendum, and then the sort of dramatic surrender of the government, actually conforms pretty perfectly to the kind of left populist cycle they set out. So you have the construction of a people out of all these disparate identities. You have, of course, within Syriza, a sort of hardcore, more classical unionists, but there is a clear broadening or sort of popularizing of the party as Syriza goes into government and takes on the Eurozone authorities. And there is the forming of a sort of chain of equivalence of all these different demands against this antagonistic pole known as the Eurozone. And just on a purely descriptive level, but also normatively, this is just exactly what they asked for. But what they don't realize is that this is not a program for policy. It's not necessarily a program for institutional reform. It's just a way of building coalitions, but there's no realization or no question whatsoever what you do once a coalition has actually been built and you want to translate politics into policy. So Chris Bickerton has an amazing argument about the rise of a specific kind of technopopulism also within Podemos, for example, where left populists are incredibly apt or incredibly good at seeing how politics happens, but they're very, very bad at realizing how politics might translate itself into policy. So what you get with Syriza is basically a kind of politics without policy, while what you get...
You like that guy, Chris Bickerton?
I'm afraid I have some interest to declare here as one of his supervisees. But I think... But I think it's the most insightful take on Syriza I know, because it shows the success of the mobilization they started, also drawing on the sort of nationalist reservoir in Greece. But in the end, when you see Riofrancos go to these Eurozone meetings, who is the prime technocrat, who's really a product of this kind of pan-European academic elite that's been constructed after Maastricht, is a sense of, well, he can do the policy, but he can't do the politics, while Syriza at home can do the politics, but they can't do the policy. In a sense, populism or left populism remains weirdly compatible with technocracy, which is, again, just an expression of helplessness, because Mouffe just says, oh, yeah, and then they just failed. Pressure was too strong. But at the same time, I don't want to deny that the pressure was too strong, but you also can't deny that there was no clear plan within Syriza whatsoever as to how they were going to force the specific change onto the Eurozone. There was just...
just saying that's a really, really good point. The compatibility of populism, left populism and technocracy, which I think often gets underplayed. That it's a kind of an escape from this, or a kind of it's somehow it's opposite, but they're actually two sides of the same coin, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think also this Blair already incarnates this kind of Janus-faced combination very well, because at the same time Blair is a lover of the people. He's a sort of populist avant la lettre in the 1990s, but I mean, the New Labour is also the prime technocratic party. So you have all these sayings by Alistair Campbell in the late 90s where he said, oh, we want like value-free policy, we need to depoliticize the civil service. So populism and technocracy already have this really romantic wedding in the 1990s. What we're seeing now is that structurally also left populism is now realizing that it's actually fatally indebted to that kind of technocratic twin.
Hey, sorry, just going to jump in here. I wanted to ask all our loyal listeners for a little favor. If you like Alpha Bunga Bunga, please review us. Even if you dislike us, go ahead, review us. Just go on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts and give us a rating or review. It would be greatly appreciated, so thank you very much in advance. Also, you might consider following us on social media. We've changed our handle to be easier to spell. We're now at BungaCast on all networks. That's BungaCast. We know lots of you listen, but not that many of you follow us on social media, which is fair enough. But we're going to be doing more on there from now on, so if you want to give us a follow, that'd be great. And, of course, tell your friends. Times are becoming increasingly turbulent, so in 2019, Alpha Bunga Bunga is where you want to be. I'll stop the self-promotion now. Back to populism. We've set up populism, and now I think maybe we should try to take it apart a little bit, which is something that I referenced in the beginning. But I think first of all, I need to make a point about José Mourinho. I think he is precisely an example of a right-wing populism. He's basically a means of allowing the elite to parade itself as the downtrodden and the excluded, kind of a way of conferring a sort of underdog grit to what are effectively aristocrats. I mean, he perfected this at Nouveau Riche Chelsea, who were vastly richer than any actual sort of aristocratic club, more traditional club. And he tried to do it at Manchester United. He even did it at the most aristocratic club of all, Real Madrid.
There's a fact he has fallen consistently, and after 3 years since his stint at Real Madrid, mean that there's a structural weakness to the new populist wave. Does that mean we only have 3 years of Bolsonaro to look forward to, or does Trump, going into his third year, have downfall on his mind?
Well, indeed. I mean, this is the thing. So one interpretation of populism is that it's people like Farage, who pretends to be a sort of parvenu, an outsider, but who's actually pretty much a member of the elite, but who confers this aura of outsiderness to what are the ultimate insiders. So it's really just a means of the elite perpetuating itself under new guise. There's that. But then there's the other interpretation of populism, which is just a mental breakdown from the liberal establishment, what we've otherwise called neoliberal order breakdown syndrome, where you see a populist boogeyman everywhere you look, in every dark corner of the demos. Effectively, anything which is popular is populist, and therefore incipiently fascist, because anything with large masses involved must be fascist, right? So you kind of got two different images of populism. I'm not quite entirely happy with either of them, but maybe let's start from here. Let's try to kind of break up this notion of what populism is and isn't. Is it something that we can use so indiscriminately?
Well, I think what Anton was saying, I think, is very useful. That there is a politics of tightly wedded together technocracy and populism that we can see across the 1990s with people like Blair and, of course, our icon, Big Silvio himself, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The difference, I think, is that it's structural. It's given the disintegration of the political mediating institutions, representative government, all the things that are supposed to connect the state to civil society, given that those traditional connections have disintegrated, it's now a structural condition, more than just the kind of style of government, as with Blair affecting to be the representative or the courtier to the people's princess.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think you can even see this, that the most staunchly self-declared anti-populist movement, the movement against Brexit or the call for a second referendum, has to call itself the people's vote, because it's just structurally coerced into using a populist language, because they don't have any base really to draw on. It is a form of astroturf politics, and even though this coalition has posed as the savior of Britain from the populist menace, what they themselves then do when they have to get the middle classes to go on a picnic on Sunday is use a paradoxically populist language, because
we like you very much, Anton. We like you very much.
No, because it is not. It's not just bad faith. So you could say, "Oh, this is just them being. This is just a case of opportunism." At the same time, it's also, as you say, shows the kind of structural necessity of using a populist language nowadays if you want to bridge the gap that has grown between civil society and the state. And this means that even liberals who will declare populism the sort of apocalyptic end of Western civilization, when they themselves have to do this semblance of popular mobilization, have to use a populist language. And I think this is what you saw already with Blair, is a smoother wedding of those two extremes, but nowadays it's just oscillating far more chaotically.
And we see the example like with Orban, for example, which we've discussed on a previous episode, where that in some ways points at a potential trajectory even for Western European nations, where you adopt right-wing populist and nationalist forms of discourse, oppressive sort of reaction against whoever they wish to clash as outsiders, but actually maintain a basic neoliberal recipe in terms of your political economy.
I think one part of what's interesting here about what you're saying in terms of needing to maintain a populist discourse in order to have some sort of connection to the masses or a base is often you kind of see in terms of this elite populism or the elite's version of populism, just the contempt they have for the people in terms of what they promote. At one level, for instance, the People's Vote, it's that huge mass of the British public was seduced by Putin's miracle propaganda or like some sort of primordial racism. Or in the case of, say, Bolsonaro, it's like just open appeals to racism and hatred. In this, you can kind of see that the elite has a very low vision of the people. And part of what this populism, or whatever you want to call it, reveals is that the sort of elite contempt for the masses comes out as their only way to appeal for it, because they have a very low view of them.
Yeah, I think that's, again, exactly right. The sort of conspirationist trope you see also in the Guardian series, where they ran at least 12 articles last month on Bannon as this sort of glorious and heroic boogeyman who was able to manipulate Michigan's and all these other states into voting for Trump just by snapping his fingers, also shows that the elite itself is just more conspiratorial than any kind of worker on the laptop in the evening who is posting comments on some kind of conspiratorial site. It's just also because they can't conceive that there is this systemic problem in Western democracies nowadays. They don't want to actually dig through the surface. And so what they have to do is fall back on conspiracy thinking in order to have a comforting narrative of how, the only reason that there has been this massive populist upsurge is because there's a small set of really evil people. And I don't know whether you've seen this, but there's now a series by HBO called Brexit. I think Benedict Cumberbatch plays Dominic Cummings, who's supposed to be the mastermind behind the Leave campaign. But the whole analytical presupposition of that series is that the reason 52% of Brits voted for Brexit is because they saw a list of well-timed ads, which this guy Cummings paid for at the right time. So there's a sort of really aggressive, almost nuclear assault on the idea that everyone has the same level of democratic intelligence, which is at the same time very, very conspiratorial, because the idea is that Cummings single-handedly caused the Brexit vote. But at the same time, there's this idea that, these people are so plainly stupid that they'll just vote for anything after they've had the right amount of propaganda injected into them.
It's kind of interesting how populism often condenses those forces into the single figure of the charismatic leader or political genius, but maybe a slightly different sort of set of questions. And this is the relation of populism to, I guess you might call it, sort of law and order. So in Hall's original analysis of populism and Thatcher, to go back to that, although we may have rejected it already in this episode, he brings up this, and I think you also have done earlier, the disciplinary or repressive side of the state. So I guess there's a kind of maybe two general questions here. How do you see populism as relating to maybe, and this possibly touches on Brexit as well, relating to a sense of losing control over the direction of society, or maybe reverting to security and order as a solution maybe to these complexities or these felt insecurities?
Well, I don't think I have the most. Maybe Phil has some more interesting thoughts on this, but my first hunch would just be that we live in an era of ascendant technocracy. But the reason that technocracy and populism are born together is precisely because technocracy realizes that it needs this sort of counterpart which can give it a semblance of legitimacy. So it's the distinction between like input and output legitimacy, where, we only care about the output, the input doesn't really matter anymore. And I think this discourse of law and order, or sort of really, really frantic emphasis on legality, which you also see in the American case with people such as Mueller and the whole Russia investigation, where you have these freaks who are obsessed with, what they call normcore politics. It's like, oh my God, there's norm erosion, people are violating norms. But at the same time, the obsession with legality actually is not really an obsession with legitimacy. If you see what all these people like Mueller have been doing in the last 20 years, is that they've been vamping up the national security state. They've been happy to bomb whatever country in the Middle East. And this kind of need to emphasize legality over legitimacy, I think also translates into the way technocrats use these populist tropes to still, give themselves a kind of aura that they're actually legitimately endowed with all this decision power.
So is it too simple to say that populism is the desperate need to try and fill that gap with popular or mass mobilization that technocratic politics creates?
Yeah, I think it just offers the illusion of mediation. I think so. The discourse of law and order gives you the idea that there is actually a strong enacting of a popular will on the state level, while at the same time this is a completely illusionary, and it's a sort of empty compensation for a different form of mediation that's become historically impossible, basically.
Well, I think relating to this, one of the things which always strikes me is the way that in populist practices, there's so much divergence within it that it's very hard to use that term to describe a definite set of political practices or a sort of definite ideology. And one of the most unifying factors is actually in language and in discourse. And that's what unifies populists in their appeal to a people and unmediated relationship between a charismatic leader and the people. But also their especially in the contemporary European post-political sphere, their raising of dissensus, of disagreement, of agonism as an actual political practice, as opposed to the sort of post-political practice of consensus, of always consensus seeking. And this is one of the reasons why so many kind of establishment liberals lose their heads, and what you called normcore politics, which actually I found kind of funny because it was a different use of normcore to what I'm used to, but this insistence on norms or acting in a Republican manner, which is basically that, you need to follow the etiquette of politics, which has been established by post-politics. And so one of the unifying factors of populism seems to me to be precisely a disrespect for those post-political norms. And so Berlusconi plays at that very well and says, all these vulgar things. Trump says these vulgar things. People like Bolsonaro, because he says, I'm just going to shoot people, and doesn't couch his words in all the post-political niceties of the ways that we're going to humanitarily intervene to bomb the shit out of some countries. That sort of form of disguising your intentions. And populists seem to not disguise their intentions. I mean, do you think that there's something in this, that what most unifies populists is in this sort of rhetoric and in the breaking of post-political linguistic discursive norms?
I think what really distinguishes populism today, as you say, is the realization of a collective trauma. So I think populism is the wrong-headed response to a real repression, because I think when you think of the term post-democracy, you really have to realize that mass democracy is actually quite a recent product. So the 20th century, although people are now trying to dismiss it as a sort of age of totalitarianism, was also a massive leap forward for humanity, in that for the first time you have these enormous groups of people who are being pulled into politics, who actually have a say in governance, which is just so unlike anything that came before, even in the 19th century. So with the introduction of the mass franchise and the creation of these mass parties, there is this real sense that for the first time people are actually having a say in governance. What you see in the last 30 years is that politics, I think even globally, but certainly in Europe and the Western world, has returned to a form of court intrigue. So it's a lot of royal infighting, and it's mainly the exercise of unelected power. Whether you think of central banks, whether you think of something like the European Commission, which is really, really not different from a sort of 18th century French royal court, because there's just no way of finding out how like this inter-court communication really happens. But the big problem with the exercise of this unelected power now, politically, is that it comes after an age in which people experience like mass mobilization, which is such a difference from the kind of mob you had in the 18th century, which had no sense that one day it might be able to exercise its democratic rights. And I think populism recognizes that there has been this sort of act of mass repression, where the massive expansion of democratic rights of the 20th century has basically been reversed. And now the people are again in a state of passivity which resembles the 18th century. But at the same time, they've also been through an episode which actually saw them exercise a certain amount of control. And I think populism recognizes this problem very acutely. It sees that something has gone awry, but at the same time, just because like a patient knows that there is a problem doesn't mean that patient has a clear idea on what the best cure is for its problem. So I think you should take populism as the authentic expression of a real collective trauma, but not necessarily as the best corrective or the sort of best remedy for the actual disease, basically.
So you've put the question very clearly there, I think. To what extent can populism be productive of a new political solution? I think from what all we've said so far, we wouldn't endorse wholeheartedly or 100% Chantal Mouffe's proposal for left populism, but at the same time we understand that it might be a means of repoliticizing society, of an attempt to regain those rights or to restart a kind of agonistic politics. So as a way of concluding, as people committed to a class-based politics of socialism effectively, how should we engage with populism in a productive manner? Should we reject it on materialist grounds? Do we need to maybe return to a certain Republican notion of the people as a good starting point at a time in which the old rhetoric of class, especially in reference to an industrial working class, doesn't have the same sort of effective appeal anymore? And maybe Mouffe is correct that that the sort of effective and aesthetic appeal should be based more on a notion of democracy, the people, citizens, rather than workers as traditionally understood by socialism.
I think, it has to be rejected, and I don't think it will. I'd be more skeptical about the achievements of the 20th century than Anton was. But I also think it should be rejected, not because of materialism or anything like that. I think populists will be quite good at providing giveaways. If you think of the Law and Justice Party in Poland or Salvini's budget, what he's trying to do with that and his showdown with the EU Commission, I think the issue is it fails to political representation. And our problem is lack of political representation. So that's the reason to oppose it.
I think also there's a distinction. I think this comes out of like the sort of hysterical Nobbs-esque sort of centrism between populism and popular. People generally have lost the political imagination to think of popular political projects in the sense they involve mass action, the popular classes or whatnot, without being populist. Somehow that's become confused. And in that sense, I would like to say that what we've seen is that the specter of populism or bringing up things like anti-corruption has become a way of offering something when you just don't have any programmatic innovations or anything to really offer your base.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I really agree with the idea that structurally it's almost become inevitable to buy into these populist strategies, but just because you're coerced into buying into them doesn't mean we actually have to do them. We have to accept them as a given. And as you say, as long, I'll say that I'm reasonably agnostic on whether a populist strategy is the best idea. I mean, if there are real practical results, I'm willing to admit that maybe there's some sense in it. But at the same time, what you see nowadays, both in theory and in practice, is a sort of complete abdication on so many crucial questions, certainly of organization. I think populism, certainly left populism, just takes the disorganization of society today as a given and then decides to act with that parameter. While I think the question of the party or the question of how you rebuild a sort of powerful, for example, trade union movement is almost never asked. And in the sense, at the same time, that's just an obsession with the media and imagery. And as you say, these easy bounties such as anti-corruption or just handouts. And this is a kind of plebeian it's a kind of plebeian republicanism, which belongs more to the ancien regime, really, than it belongs to our current era of late modern democracy. So I'm agnostic, but that agnosticism often slips in what I'd call a very strong skepticism.
Alright, that's it for now. Join us on the 3rd of January for the first in our Übermenschen of Capital series, how liberal capitalism itself sets up heroic authoritarian figures in order to justify itself, or save its own skin. The first in that series is about entrepreneurial douchebags with Alex Gurevich. There's lots more exciting stuff planned throughout 2019. We've got new sounds, a new look, live events, more series, and the sharpest guests around. Catch you in the new year, and have a very happy whatever you might celebrate. Bye-bye.
I just wanted to ask Phil about the 20th century, because I get your point.
Oh, don't get him started on that, fuck's sake.
No, it's just I get that it's the era of failed revolution. At the same time, I have a feeling there's now an attempt as just to paint it monochromatically, almost as a sort of totalitarian nightmare. And I very much disagree with this idea that the 20th century obviously was a disaster in many ways, but it also, for the first time, showed what it meant for people to actually be involved in institutions. And I think we're in danger of losing even the realization that that was once possible, basically.
I'd agree with you that there's a danger of losing that, but I don't think I would badge it with the 20th century. And I think every engagement with the 20th century has to come from the frank acknowledgement of failure for the left. I think any attempts to redeem it in various ways, women won the vote, or Gorbachev stopped the Cold War, or Hitler beat the Nazis, Stalin beat the Nazis, and all that. Always,
I told you not to ask him about this about the 20th century.
No, but it's
in the 21st century be remembered
as redeeming failure. And I think that's, it has to be, you have to start I think the best account is still the one that's in Hobsbawm's book, where he talks about the astonishing age of extremes, age of contradiction. But the age of the failure, the left's failure has to be the starting point, I think. And anything which doesn't start from there is fundamentally dishonest.
He also talks about the change of life, and the change of the pace of life just massively accelerating as well. So I mean, it's politically very mixed bag, but socially, I mean, it's
not
unbelievably.
A mixed bag. It's a astonishing defeat and setback for humanity.
Well,
but
this is the thing. This is the thing, though. Are we today in the 21st century meant to adopt the perspective of the 19th century, in which case you conclude with Phil that the 20th century was a disaster, so much potential, a certain telos was not reached, and in fact there were so many deviations, setbacks, disasters, right? That's one way to look at it. The other is that after the defeats, looking at it in the 21st century, looking back, it does look like the post-war period in the rich countries was a peak of civilization, a trans-historical golden age, genuinely, without irony, in that the great masses were, for the first time in human history, incorporated into politics, into forms of rule, had a higher standard of living. There was fast advances in.
It's just not true.
Yeah.
They were incorporated into corporate states after having been totally pulverized, won to totalitarian war machines in the Second World War.
And yet, was the condition of the working class not better in the middle part of the 20th century than in the first?
The miracle happened is because the German workers have been defeated by fascism. The post-war miracle is pre-programmed into the fact that the German workers had no way to resist capitalism in the 50s and 60s.
I think the 21st century, if we are to believe the current narrative, we are witnessing the reign of possibly the most powerful leader in the history of the last 200 years, which is Putin.
Elon Musk.
Putin doesn't need hard power. Putin has the ability to seduce, cajole, and control with mere thoughts most of the power blocks of Western Europe and, it seems, the United States.
We just need to win Putin over to socialism, and then we'll be fine. Like, he can just do it for us.
So basically, we have to get Putin to go back to his ideology 40 years ago.
Rule by KGB, that's the grand future that we're painting.
Well, I mean, if you look at what actually goes on in Europe nowadays, it's not that far off anyway. Yeah. I mean, the point, I think, just to respond to you again, Phil, is more like, it sounds like a really lame way of responding, but a dialectical take on the 20th century. should also should of course start with the acknowledgement of failure. But at the same time, the kind of revisionist move you really want to resist is the idea that it was not even worth trying, or that the century didn't open on a more promissory note. I mean, because this is the whole point of your book, basically, is that from 1914 to 1923, there's a real chance that humanity might actually take a better turn. And I think what you see nowadays is just a tendency to say, like, oh, but the kind of questions that people tried to answer in the 20th century were the wrong questions all along. But I think that's intellectually very dangerous, because we're really at danger of just there's so much like common sense knowledge, certainly within the Marxist tradition, that's been completely squandered and lost. So if this is also, when you read Mouffe, it's just like if you'd read like one page of Lenin, or if you'd read one page of the political Marx, then there are so many of these dogmas that could just be suspended instantaneously.
Oh, absolutely, and I agree with that very much. And I also think, it's trying to. There's no escape from our tasks. It's a point. It's a point I've been making with response to Brexit, is that all the props are all there. A disaffected, deeply disaffected and immiserated working class, a capitalist economy that's in trouble in all sorts of ways, a ruling class that's in total disarray, political institutions that aren't functioning, the state in crisis. All the props and the scenery are there, and the actors are missing. And this is the only thing that's missing, is the actors. But the theatre has just been set up for us. The scenery and the props have all been set up for us, as if they're invisible.
Yeah, an emergent podcasting network that can organise people.
The apparatus.
Exactly. Yeah. You can actually see it's getting political. We're living in a political moment by the fact that Mouffe has completely changed her usual impenetrable and painful writing style to make something that, if it's not quite well written, is at least semi-accessible.
That's a really good point, actually.
It's only 60% is impenetrable.
Yeah.
No, it's good, man. I was amazed. Ben is absolutely right. And, there was this...
You thought it was well written?
It's very lucid. She makes
in
I
comparison
disagree.
to hegemony and socialist
Absolutely,
sure.
Man.
Oh, sure. But that's the point. We're all agreed.
She gives a good account of, she gives a perfectly serviceable, good account of populism, I think, in conventional kind of understanding. She makes her case kind of fairly clearly. And there was, this misogynist take in the academy that Leclerc was the brains behind the outfit. But I think, looking at this, it seems to me that she's very, very clear. Even if she evades her own political responsibility for our current problems, she writes clearly and she's capable of conceptual thought.
I don't know. I thought
that's not like damning with faint praise. She's capable of conceptual thought.
She has object permanence. Well done. Well, I thought the political recommendations, such as they were just like terrible. I really didn't like that book. We should ask Anton that he's the guest. He's the expert. We know what the four of us think. We're much more interested in what somebody actually knows what they're talking about. Thanks.
I think there's still too much of a Blair hangover when it comes to spelling out again what her political vision entails practically, because it's. I don't want to call it sloganeering, but there's a sense in which she's happy to stick with the abstractions because that will make it most serviceable for her to be taken up by actual political movements, because it's both so general and so vague at the same time that you can basically do anything with it. And this is again what Chris Bickerton highlights, is just like there is no vision of policy there. Obviously you see, Corbynite Labour has been very, very big on policy at the same time. But given the question, for example, ending central bank independence, actually reordering British political economy in a very drastic way, are things that are really not yet on the table. And Mouffe just speaks to this kind of, again, abdication that she doesn't want to ask those questions because it's not at the center of her approach. She's really, really focused on strategy and how you build a coalition. But what Syriza shows is that, well, you can get the coalition, but then you can clearly just lose that coalition in one day, because there is no, it never petrifies or never solidifies into institutions. And if you can't actually make a coalition inhabit institutions, then I don't see how you have any durable vision for politics, basically.
So that's the whole thing with like this sort of movement of movements, or as Phil called it, the Rainbow Coalition, as sort of a natural tendency in an age where a bunch of different struggles are popping up. They're naturally going to come together, and like moves on to that question. If you articulate them as a common people which have a shared struggle, that's enough. But there's no question of organizational form, of how to exercise power, or policy, or things which create something that goes beyond sort of a brief moment where perhaps you're capable of winning an election or winning an opinion poll. That's the whole thing with this movements of movement things. The natural tendency is assumption that when people take to the streets or when people start voicing issues or civil society is highly mobilized, to use a really horrible phrase, that it's naturally going to lead to progressive outcomes. But I think what we've seen in the last few years, and I guess if you look at the 20th century, is that this simply isn't true. I mean, part of who I think has got a really interesting argument on this is Dylan Riley. You should all read his essay in the New Left Review, which sort of makes reference to this, that he argues that in some ways fascism is an authoritarian democracy, which is precisely a product of a highly mobilized civil society incorporated within a political project, rather than some sort of intrinsically anti-democratic in the sense of like just straight authoritarian without associational organizations being part of it experience.
I think the thing that's missing, and I don't know if this is the key to a deeper insight into the limitations of populism, but the thing that was missing with Syriza was the will to self-rule. At the end of the day, they simply did not want to rule Greece, and they didn't wish to put the question of self-determination before the Greek people. And as long as they were unwilling to do that, then they would be cucks to the EU, or Varoufakis would cuck them to the EU, and that's what happened. And I think that question of do you want to rule yourself and do you want control over your life is it's the most single important political question, and I'm not sure it's the one that the left is willing to ask, let alone whether populists are willing to ask it.
Yeah, I agree again. And I mean, this is also what you see when Varoufakis is moving into the European level now, is that his proposal for a reformed Europe is basically, let's get some Keynesian technocrats in the ECB, as long as all these sort of badly trained ordo liberals are pushed out of Frankfurt and we populate this institution with my guys, then everything will be fine and we'll be able to have an expansionary,
Jesus, he's such a cunt.
and I think
Phil, say what you really think.
I think it gets hard to it's wrong to call someone who's might just be merely deluded a cunt, because cunt implies some intentionality to be a cunt, and I don't think he wills himself into being a cunt.
He's politically the most deluded person possibly in the entire world. As Kostas Lapavitsas put it, a man whose experience shows that the EU can't be reformed, arguing that it can. And
I'm sorry, Hillary Clinton beats him in that respect. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
She's going to run again.
Yeah.
At least Varoufakis believes in something.
Will she run again?
He believes in himself, I guess.
I think she's gonna run until she dies. I think she's just we'll be in 2050 and it'd be like, we're in the 8th run of Hillary. This is
Cyborg Hillary will finally rule over us.
Well, it's a death cult. It's going to be Chelsea Clinton after she's done.
So she's like Forrest Gump or a shark. She just has to keep running, keep moving for the entire.
So you're saying Hillary Clinton is the Forrest Gump of American politics?
No.
Just turns up because Forrest Gump turns up at opportune moments. Hillary kind of does the opposite.
George, you made a very fine point, I think, about Hillary being a great tragic figure of contemporary politics in a way that hasn't been properly appreciated thus far.
Thank you. I mean, I didn't make that this evening. I've made that previously, but yeah.
No, I know, but I mean, it seems like this is the natural moment to bring this point back to our listeners.
Are our listeners still listening at this point? I thought
totally listening.
We have no feedback. There's no way of knowing this right at the moment.
Yeah, good point. No, I mean that is I do firmly believe that she is a great tragic figure. She cannot appreciate just how damned her project is and how she's completely isolated from the American public, and that's why her will to power, such as it is, drives her onto these increasingly doomed and dreadful campaigns.
I mean, if she has any sort of self-consciousness and sense of history, which, it's debatable whether she does or not, but she would surely then see, I mean, her bitterness and a sense of her own tragedy would be directly in reference to the fact that she missed the moment, that it was that it had to be pre-financial crisis, and then she could have had her time. So if she's the slightest bit aware, she would know that her own bitterness, if she feels that she deserves to rule, and she obviously does, and even if we were to agree that she should have deserved to rule at a certain moment, then that moment has definitely gone, and that's probably why she feels really bitter,
It was Corey Robin made the point, in the sense that, she's an intelligent, accomplished woman. I mean, she doesn't have much to her name in terms of actual kind of policy success, because her attempt to reform healthcare under the Clinton administration famously was terrible. She's a terrible warmongering neocon and all of that. But she kind of embodied the hopes of a particular kind of generation of post-68 women, and they were entirely crushed and taken away. And I think so. There is a tragedy to her if you see her in the context of a particular kind of generational ascent that was thwarted. But the lack of tragic figures in politics is important, I think, because it's partly a reflection of neoliberalism as well. I think they just kind of go from, it's just another job, another high-paying elite job where you go to Davos. You can go like as David Cameron as a PR man or an ad man or something, or as Tony Blair sucking off like a Central Asian dictator, or you can go as the Prime Minister of Britain. It's all the same thing. And so that sense of political tragedy has gone, I think. Maybe Gordon Brown was the last kind of tragic figure of British politics.
Oh, Varoufakis, I think. It's a very good point. But I think
if you want real tragedy, just come to Latin America. I'm sorry, but Brazil is too tragic right now. But
not with individuals. It's not to say, obviously, there's national tragedy.
Oh,
Dilma, that's true, actually. There is a tragic character to Dilma.
Or Lula, the most popular president, the most successful politician of recent history, ending up in jail. That's extremely tragic.
I'm not sure it's classed as actual tragedy, though. I mean,
it's not tragedy. That's defeat, I think. Yeah. And it's tragic for Brazil, but I'm not sure it's not tragic in the way that you get
arguably
kind of...
Pitte's period in power was more tragic.
Yes, I think that you can make the case of tragedy there.
Realize the potential of the moment.
And also, I mean, to underestimate the force, of all people, for them to, Dilma, being tortured by the military dictatorship, for people like them to underestimate what they're up against, that is actually tragic.
Yeah.
The function of Hillary in the liberal imaginary, which has really been sort of shaken to the core since the populist revolts of 2016, is also she has to remain because she keeps the whole ideology together. She's the kind of sort of empty heart that actually gives liberalism its coherence, which actually structurally no longer has. And I think it's her generation, which is really the kind of West Wing generation as well. So all the people who watch the West Wing, but there's this crazy moment in the West Wing where an entire generation grew up on this series. So instead of Rawls or Marx or Isaac Deutscher's biography of Trotsky, the idea was now you have to watch the West Wing because this is going to give you your indispensable initiation into politics. But even there, there's this moment when Bartlett, who's this lipcock president, as they say, within the West Wing, actually wants to introduce a kind of Medicare bill, very similar to the one I think the Clinton want to introduce, and it obviously fails. Like, there are 3 episodes, and it's a complete failure. But still, the series manages to spin it into this sort of success story where, but they tried valiantly, but still they failed. And I think this is, even in their wildest dreams, as someone said, liberals fail to do anything. They don't accomplish anything because the West Wing is a sort of psychoanalytical fever dream, and still their fantasies about failure. And I think the same for Hillary. Is like, people ask, how can she keep on insisting that she's the chosen one in the face of so much demoralization and falsification? But at the same time, I think, but that's exactly the point, because liberals have this addiction. Liberals have become addicted to a certain sense of decline, almost, in that sense. So
If we're being really self-critical here, we could say that the left has as well. I mean, if you look at certain left responses, certainly in the past 2-3 years to the emergence of protests, you can see it with the Gilets jaunes, which is something we talked about last time round, which is to see people on the streets, to see the possibility of power, to see the possibility of even just being merely popular amongst a segment of the population, and a rejection of that from certain leftists, even left intellectuals, and just to think, well, I'm actually happier in our little marginal position being the most pure, honest, true leftist out there.
You see this totally in the United States. I mean, like, basically, like, the whole anti-Bernie left insisting that anyone who supports Bernie or, like, the Bernie project is like a sheepdogging project back at the Democratic Party instead of like a unexpected rise of socialism again. They're still grumbling on as just basically people now agree with us. This is terrible. I hate it.
No, he is a Democratic sheepdog cuck, and there is no.
Philip, he's also the best thing to happen to the American left. God, I don't know since when.
What's the second best thing?
The second best thing, because many
Pamela
things.
Anderson, probably.
Yeah, Pamela Anderson.
No, Pamela Anderson.
Yeah, Anton, I wanted to ask you about something else, which actually came up during your article you wrote with Ronan, dealing with that wonderful and insightful Guardian populism series about the legacy of Hofstadter in the liberal imagination and sort of responses to right-wing politics. Can you expand on that for us?
Yeah, I just think that the pedigree of what we know as liberal anti-populism today is actually very, very old and was first coined in the Cold War, basically. So the role populism plays in American historiography in the 40s and 50s is really as this kind of connecting element between the two extremes that liberalism fears, which is fascism and Stalinism. And obviously, liberals think that fascism is bad. They also think that Stalinism is bad. How do you find a sort of common denominator between these two forms of bad politics? And obviously, it's populism. And it really required a sort of real historical amputation in the American case, where the late 19th century American populist movement, which is also the movement that invented the word populism, actually had to be presented as the precursor to American fascism and McCarthyism, which turned out to be a real scholarly hatchet job, but which did a very, very useful, played a really useful political role for liberals in the 50s and 60s. Because, I mean, to present certainly populism in the South, or the original American populism in the late 19th century, as a quintessential form of racism, completely forgets that actually the whole Jim Crow order was constructed precisely because it was meant to preclude anything resembling like the biracial populist coalition you had in the 1890s, which was also the movement out of which basically Eugene V. Debs, the biggest American socialist ever, grew. And I think this is really the big bang of liberal anti-populism, which is, of course, Hofstadter, but it also includes people such as Arthur Schlesinger and people such as Edward Shills. And you just see the transplantation of this American liberal anti-populist vocabulary, which is mainly prominent in the 50s and 60s, into a global framework in the 60s and 70s in modernization theory. And then in the 1980s and the 1990s, you first see it popping up in Europe. And there's actually a direct line with someone like Cas Mudde, who writes his first work in the late 1990s and who's obsessed with this idea that populism is about identity, it's about status anxiety. There's a sort of refusal to think about the fact that populism might have real roots in a sort of mass dispossession of decision-making that's actually going on in Europe. But this is, again, just a symptom of the fact that Mudde is operating with this Cold War vocabulary, because it's purely a surface reading of populism. It's a question of, we don't have to actually look at the roots and causes. We can just stigmatize these people as sort of pathological, paranoid lunatics. And once these people have been pushed out of the political arena, we can get on with our liberal pastimes, basically.